I'm here because all of a sudden we have friendlies in the intelligence establishment who many of us thought were going to reveal whatever happened in the Epstein case so that we could finally understand what role it is playing in the corruption of our government, which many of us suspect to be a profound contribution to the corruption of our governmental structures. To make it succinct, Jeffrey Epstein appeared to be collecting compromat on powerful people. So putting them in sexual situations where they revealed their depravity. He recorded these things, and his library of videos could then be used to control a great many people's behavior because they would fear being exposed if they didn't do what he and whoever was in charge of him, presuming that was somebody, wanted done. And in fact, we've had some indications that maybe finally the good guys are in charge and we're going to see something. In fact, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, said there was a tremendous amount of video evidence and it was taking time to go through it all, but that this was going to be done.
It's just the volume, and that's what they're going through right now. The FBI is diligently going through that.
And then on the heels of that hopeful announcement, we've got some perplexing data from Dan Bongino and Kash Patel. So do you want to run that little clip of the interview with Kash Patel and Dan Bongino? Kash?
You said Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide. People don't believe it.
Well, I mean, listen, they have a right to their opinion, but as someone who has worked as a public defender, as a prosecutor, who's been in that prison system, who's been in the Metropolitan Detention Center, who's been in segregated housing, you know a suicide when you see one, and that's what that was.
He killed himself. You want me to? I've seen the whole file. He killed himself.
Okay, now, first of all, I don't know what to make of Dan Bongino saying he's seen the file and Epstein killed himself. For this story to make any sense, the file, to the extent that it reflects him having killed himself, is a crime scene of its own. Now, I'm not saying I know one way or the other, but I am saying there's something shocking about the idea that the place that these new intelligence officials have gone in order to figure out what happened is the file, and that having seen a file that reflects a suicide, that they are satisfied by this is very surprising. Mm-hmm. I also think it is worth, so there's lots of speculation on why. Do you want to maybe run the other Kash Patel with Joe Rogan clip, Jen?
This guy's not the only guy to kill himself in prison. It happens, I don't know how often.
Right.
All the time.
Even if he killed himself in prison. So if he was murdered in prison, crazy, right?
Yeah.
You could see why very powerful people wouldn't want
If he
him
was
talking.
murdered in segregated housing, in isolation, after being on suicide watch in a place in a detention center that I've physically been in myself, it would be fiction. It's just, in my experience, that is not doable.
It's not doable even for the most powerful and wealthiest people in the world?
Yeah.
All right. So point one that I think has to be on the table. Again, I don't know what happened to Jeffrey Epstein. It is possible that he understood what the rest of his life was going to look like and decided not to live it. But the idea that Kash Patel, the FBI chief, is convinced because he's been inside prisons that it would be impossible for a murder to have taken place and readily possible for this guy on suicide watch to have killed himself doesn't pass the smell test. So let me just point this out. If Jeffrey Epstein was a compromat specialist who was willing to sex traffic children let's say that he belonged to some intelligence agency of somebody's. Well, then that intelligence agency is willing, or whatever arm of it ran Epstein, was willing to sex traffic children. It was willing to destroy children. Of course, it's willing to murder in order to keep that quiet. How many people do you have to murder in order for the evidence that Kash Patel feels would certainly have emerged for it not to emerge? In other words, if everybody who saw something that Kash Patel is assuming would have come out has been given credible evidence that if they voice what they've seen, that will be the end of them, then you would imagine it would be unusually quiet. So my point is, again, I don't know what happened to Epstein, and I don't know the truth of what he was up to. But I do know that the people who are in charge of intelligence in the U.S. should be thinking along these lines. They're dealing with a potentially major conspiracy in which the most powerful people in the world have everything to lose if they get to the bottom of it. They should expect all tactics, including the intimidation and murder of witnesses, are on the table. And therefore, they should assume when they get to the FBI file and it doesn't contain incriminating evidence with respect to a murder of Jeffrey Epstein, or I guess maybe we'll play this clip in a second, or doesn't contain evidence of compromise in the videos recovered from Epstein's island, they should assume that that is not evidence. And actually, this goes very well with what we were just discussing. Mm-hmm. If you attempt to reconcile the story of Jeffrey Epstein with a file that contains evidence that suggests nothing special happened, if you force yourself to process that file as if it's factual, then you will not be able to figure out what happened to Jeffrey Epstein. You'll just have to accept that false story. On the other hand, if you say, yeah, I would absolutely expect the level of concealment of the evidence of Jeffrey Epstein to be spectacular and to require absolutely unusual approaches in order to unearth it, right? This is liable to be the most protected story in the history of the world, given what we think, the number of people who were seemingly compromised by this. So you should expect cloak after cloak after cloak after misdirection, and to have the chief of the FBI telling us,
the director and the deputy director of the FBI,
telling us this. It doesn't. It's strange. And so, of course, there's been lots of speculation about what this means. Do you want to play that last clip of Kash Patel on Rogan talking about the videos?
And is there video from the island?
Not of what you want. The people out there have filled the void with can't wait to see X, Y, or Z.
Right, speculation.
And I'm like, here's the other thing I've been asking for, right? Openly. If you have information on this, call us. Tell us. The best resource we have is the American people in the world.
Fantastic. He's almost cracked the case. He's found the best sources, and it's us.
That's unexpected.
Yeah. Okay.
Why would the American people who've been following this a little bit and pretty sure the evidence suggests that there's a lot of nefarious stuff going on, why would any of us have any particular data?
No, in fact, what we've done, Kash, is we have loudly proclaimed that the story does not add up from our perspective and that it appears that Jeffrey Epstein did not kill himself. Why do we say Jeffrey Epstein did not kill himself? It's not just because it seems like it's awfully convenient that he died, but it just so happened that the cameras weren't working and the guys that were supposed to be watching him to preventing him from doing that were asleep. So the point is the story is fishy. It's implausible. So no, going to the American public is not the way. Now,
so weird.
There's been a lot of speculation,
but maybe quite effective. Maybe like the business model for the IVF company. It's like, oh, but this is going to make you look like such a good guy. It's so open. This is transparent.
Well, he's very likable. I want to believe him, but what he's saying doesn't add up. No. And let's put it this way. I think in the world of the sophisticates, the power elites, there is a whole lot of narrative sculpting, and that there are moves in the narrative sculpting that we normies don't get. Right? So there's one thing where some story has broken wide open, right? Like the lab leak, right? At first, we were insane for thinking that this virus might have leaked from a lab. And then it turned out there were a lot of people with skills who were willing to do the work. It turned out the pangolin story didn't work. The frozen ferret badger steak
popsicles. Yep.
Yeah, the whole thing. One story after another collapsed. And finally, you've got, basic acknowledgement that not only does a majority of the public believe that it leaked from a lab, but the officials also privately think that that's a pretty likely explanation, yada, yada, yada. And then something will pop up and it'll be like, nope, finally. And it will attempt to unmake all of the progress that was so hard won in the direction of reality. And so, we've got one of these with the new mRNA shot that Moderna advertised that Bobby Kennedy is telling us will be exposed to a true placebo-controlled trial, which, yeah, it should be exposed to a true placebo-controlled trial. However, given what we've learned about the mRNA platform and all of the harm done, it's weird that it gets to rebrand as a, new with a smaller piece of the spike protein. It's like, well, what evidence do you have that any of that worked to the benefit of people, right? It looks like a huge failure, and yet you're coming out with a new version, new and improved. And it's like, you would have to improve it an awful lot before you got anywhere near positive, right? So it's that sort of thing. And there does seem to be a wide scale effort. A lot of bots or sock puppets online are suddenly chiming in, accusing you of being a conspiracy theorist if you think there's something wrong with the Epstein story. And it's like, wait a minute, didn't we solve that like years ago? Isn't Ghislaine Maxwell in jail for the crimes that she and Jeffrey Epstein committed, right? She's in jail. So what was that about, if not about the crimes that Kash Patel is now telling us he doesn't have evidence for? So anyway, lots of speculation about whether or not somebody has gotten to Dan Bongino and Kash Patel. That would be truly frightening. What would that even sound like, right? You're going to go muscle the head of the FBI? Maybe, right? That would be one explanation. Another explanation, one that I think a lot of us would prefer, is that there's some deeper story here in which they're having to lie to us because Jeffrey Epstein is in witness protection. And, I don't believe this could possibly be the case. For one thing, it's a hypothesis that makes predictions about what cases are going to emerge. So, but anyway, it's at least a hypothesis on the table. But I have to wonder if, that would be an amazing story. Whose body was pulled out of the prison that wasn't Epstein? Well, there's lots of photographic evidence that seems inconsistent between Epstein as a living person and the corpse that was pulled out of the jail, if it was even a corpse. But if this were that story, if there was somehow a corpse that had been swapped in order to get Jeffrey Epstein out of the prison, he's somewhere, and as despicable a human being as he is, he's been given some kind of amnesty in order to go after the people who are really even much more terrible. Okay, but then does the chief and deputy chief of the FBI destroy their own credibility on major media by saying that these files don't contain any of this information? That seems a really weird way to spend their credibility. But they need their credibility. We need them to have their credibility, and they're blowing it apart in public. That does not seem like the move you would make if this was about witness protection. But all right. The final point, the one that I think is maybe most important, is let's say that the thing that we all suspect is actually true, that Jeffrey Epstein was working for one of the elite intelligence services of the world, collecting compromat for the purpose of the state that controlled that security service to control politics elsewhere, like in the US. Then there's a library, There's a library of materials that Epstein collected that exists somewhere. As you try to advance the case, as you try to discover where that material is, what role it is playing in governance, as you attempt to do that, human beings are going to find themselves faced with, as we discussed before, threats necessary to keep it quiet. But also, you're talking about a control architecture for some huge part of the governance structures of the West, which means that the danger of people who get close, instead of them outing what they've discovered, them partnering with that and becoming agents with a great deal of control is overwhelming. So I just think we need to understand that when we are talking about a potential conspiracy with this much power, the novel problems in revealing its nature are liable to be profound. And we in the public ought to just remember that that's bound to be part of what's going on. I'm not saying that's what's going on with Bongino and Patel, but I am saying that part of why this story seems impossible to break, even though the rough outlines of it seem apparent enough to us, is that when you have that much power, that is a tremendous advantage in corrupting or silencing anybody who gets anywhere near it. And whoever has that library still has that power.
Yes, they do.